And we are thankful that there is now no condemnation to those who are in Christ Jesus. And what a precious thought that is, that as your children, we are in Christ. And Father, we pray that today, even as we seek to glean more from your word, would you not just fill our minds and our intellects, but our hearts, resulting in supernatural actions that would take place as we appropriate these things that we are learning today. And we thank you for Dr. Arnold and all the work he has put in, even though he's currently on furlough. And we pray that you bless him and all the fellow students here this evening. For it's in Christ and we pray. Amen.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, I'm excited to just jump straight in, so I'm happy to do that right away. And as I said, we will focus primarily on Romans 7, and then we'll get into Romans 8 a little bit. But a few things that I needed to just wrap up, and these were things that I was a little rushed on Romans 6 last time, so there are some themes here that I did not explain, but actually they're quite related to what we're talking about today anyway. So I wanted to go ahead and talk about a few of those things. Here's one of them. If you go back and you look in Romans 6 around verses 12 and 13, you're going to hit the language of the body and of the members. So let me put that up here and we'll just look at this briefly. As I said, this relates to where we're going here. But one of the, I'm going to frame this as a problem. One of the struggles I have in some of this section is a division between the body and the spirit that could almost sound like a kind of Gnosticism. All right, let me show you what I mean, and then let me explain what I'm talking about. So here, let not therefore sin reign in your mortal body to make you obey its passions. Do not present your members to sin as instruments of righteousness, but present yourself to God as those who have been brought from death to life, and your members to God as instruments for righteousness. And the reason I think this is significant, if you get a little further down in chapter 7, you're going to have the same kind of concept with an emphasis on the body, the concern about the body, in a way that someone could read this as a notion of the body is evil and the spirit is positive. Okay, so the idea that we have to somehow free ourselves, or the problem is the body, and I instead need to free myself and focus more on the spirit. I've heard presentations like that of sanctification, that the notion, if you want to grow, then you've got to be less focused on the physical or the body. Sometimes this is going to get connected in with specifically like sensuality kind of ideas, and instead you need to be more focused in the spiritual realm. And if you keep on going into chapter 8, you're going to see the same kind of thing now with the emphasis on the flesh. So here I'll show you in chapter 8 the flesh versus the mind concept. And here you see this sort of idea. Those who live according to the flesh set their minds on the things of the flesh. Those who live according to the spirit set their minds on the things of the spirit. To set the mind on the flesh is death. To set the mind on the spirit is life and peace. So do you get my concept here that could bother me a little bit if you read this text wrong, if you read it in a shallow way, kind of reading it to say, okay, the body is negative and therefore we need to try to focus on the spirit or be spiritual and focus on the spirit instead of the body, leads in some awkward directions. And as I referred to a little bit ago, Gnosticism, in the sense that the physical is bad, the spiritual is good. And you end up then with, bad practical implications for all of this. So how do we understand Romans 6 and 7 all the way up through 8 in a way that we are affirming that we are one being? I think that's my idea. affirming that we are one being and not dividing it off. Okay, the physical is bad and the spiritual is good, so therefore try to deny my body or push away the body, when elsewhere you're going to see this notion that God created us as whole persons, and therefore we shouldn't be dividing things off. Something similar to that is just a bit later on, if you're noticing a pattern with the flesh. And again, this is going to come up in chapter 6, but it's going to come up also again in chapter 7, more strongly in chapter 7. A couple of places where you feel like Paul's almost saying, he's making almost a division between himself and the flesh. Kind of me, and I'm separate from the flesh. So let me show you what I mean by that. Here, let me share across here. Okay. Yes. Just wrong screen. Here we are. Okay. So here, if I do what I do not want, I agree with the law that it is good. But verse 17, now it is no longer I who do it, but sin which dwells in me. I know that nothing good dwells in me, that is in my flesh. I have the desire to do what is right, but not the ability to do it. So then I do not do what I want, but it is no longer I who do it, but sin which dwells within me. Do you see, again, sort of my idea? I think it's related. You could read this wrongly to say, kind of, if the whole person, me, that's all of me, the whole person is me, and then there's like a sub part of me that's the bad part. And we're dividing off as though, okay, here's the good me, or the primarily good me, but within that, here's the flesh, and that's the bad part of me, or the body. These terms are related. And so that part of me is the bad part of me. Therefore, the solution for my problem is to try to do whatever I can to set that aside. I'm concerned to want to maintain that we are whole persons, meaning all of me is created by God, all of me is made in the image of God, all of me is broken by the fall, and it doesn't just work to set that off in the flesh or set that off in the body. Okay, so that's a concern I'm going to kind of leave open here. I've showed you a couple of statements that Paul mentions that maybe could be a little troubling, as though he's going that direction. Is he? What's happening here? I'll give you one more expression of this that sometimes comes up. And it's derived, I think, largely from Romans 6, but then also Romans 8. And maybe you've heard this illustration, I don't know. But it's an illustration of the black dog versus the white dog. It's an illustration where I'd be curious if you put that in the chat, how many maybe have heard this illustration. They'll talk about, there's a dog, two dogs, and one is weak and one is powerful. And so the person comes along and wants to know, okay, between these two dogs, which is the stronger? And so then he sees the two, and the white dog is much stronger. And then over time he leaves, he comes back, and now the black dog is dominating the white dog. It's flipped around. And the question goes, what happened here? And the answer was, well, the person who is taking care of the dogs fed the one I feed. He fed the white dog instead of the black dog. So over time now, the white dog is, I forget which one I started out with before, but the white dog is dominant because he's been fed. And so what you end up with here is that our sanctification is kind of won by pitting one part of our natures against another. Kind of like here, I'll put it back into this framework again. If I'm doing it like this, the assumption would go, here's my flesh, over here is my spirit. Okay, and so the key to sanctification, I guess I should have done a lowercase s on the spirit, but the key to sanctification is to feed my spirit, right? So that this part of me grows more strong and more dominant. And then by that, I'm somehow able to kind of push this part of me down. And so what I've got within me is a warring of my good part of me. The good part of me is the spirit. That's like the white dog, or anyway, we can just do different colors if we want. A brown dog and a white dog or something. Brown dog and a black dog. So feed the brown dog, that's the good part of me, and starve the black dog, the bad part of me, or something like that. And, okay, so you are trying to emphasize this part of your person in order to have victory. There are aspects of what he's saying here that can be interpreted, I would argue, twisted to be understood that way. I understand the illustration. It's not bad in itself. If you feed certain appetites, they grow. Okay, I get that. If you allow certain things to get out of control, or you indulge yourself, then eventually, practically speaking, you reach a point where those things are really hard to withstand or restrain. But is that what's going on as the core programmatic vision of sanctification across Romans 6 and Romans 7? I'm obviously going to argue that it's not. But I want us to kind of develop the idea as we go forward today. So that's overall where we're headed. And there will be different layers of how that pieces together as we go. Okay. Let me just touch one other issue that was there that I did not touch before, and I want to make sure it's taken care of. Actually, this also will relate to something we will hit later on as we keep on going. But Paul makes a statement that sin is not counted where there is no law. And that's an interesting, this is chapter 5, verse 13, actually. It's an interesting question and an interesting issue that I'll address a bit later. Excuse me. Okay. Sin indeed was in the world before the law was given. Sin is not counted where there is no law. And that would be a problem if I'm putting that into the framework of what I had way back in chapters 1 and 2. Remember, he argued that everybody has the law. So I just want to kind of touch off on that and resolve that issue. And this also helps set up for something we'll hit in chapter 6 a bit later on. But the idea of this goes where the idea is that it is not counted as transgression. I think that's the distinction. We are, all of us, guilty, and we are, all of us, aware of the law. In fact, the argument across the book is that sin predated the Mosaic law. So it's not that we are innocent apart from the law, as though if I never received the law, then we'd have the noble savage thing or something. I would be innocent because I received no law. It can't be that. But I think the idea of it is transgression. I can't remember if I said this earlier last time we met or not. But the idea would be, if my children sometimes will have an intuition that I would not like something, and I can tell, I can see on their face, they'll do something that's a little, maybe on the edge, and then the child looks at you like, okay, so what's he gonna do? But there is a difference. They kind of have a suspicion he probably would not want me to do this, so they're kind of watching me while they do it or something. But there would be a difference if I say to them, okay, don't do that. Stop doing that. And at that point, if they continue on and do it, then the distinction would be it's now a transgression. It's now a transgression of a clear and known law. And that's different. That's more, that's heavier. The weight of that is heavier. Okay. And I think that's his concept when he says sin is not counted when there is no law, where there is no law. It's not as transgression. A person still stands guilty. But the nature of the law is that it makes the standard so clear and absolute now that a person stands condemned in the strongest way. Okay. And last concept to just clean up from chapter 6 is the statement he makes that we are not under law. So again, a question of what that would mean, and I talked about this a little bit, but just to explain what we would mean by it. 2 times we see it. Sin will not have dominion over you since you are not under law but under grace. Are we then to sin because we are not under law but under grace? So a couple of possibilities that people talk about as possible renderings of this, and I'll show you here written out in notes form. Not under law could refer to the condemnation of the law. You're not under its condemnation. It could mean legalism in the sense of attempting to achieve righteousness by keeping the law. It could mean the racial division of the law between Jew and Gentile. It could be the moral demands of needing to obey the Torah. Each one of those I find a little problematic. And here's, I think, the solution, or the way I would want to read this. It's critical to read this in the context of Paul's other statements of the law. And these are the statements that start to resolve some of the issue, or start to build out some of the issues that we're going to hit in chapter 7. Statements that talk about the law actually as exacerbating or increasing our struggle. Again, we view the law as positive, but we know also that the law has a role actually of pointing us to our need. This is like the Galatians 4 idea. So let me show you a couple of the passages that do this. Here, we know that whatever the law says, it speaks to those who are under the law, so that every mouth may be stopped and the whole world may be held accountable to God. By the works of the law, no human being will be justified in his sight. Here's the role of the law. Through the law comes knowledge of sin. Chapter 3, verse 21. The righteousness of God has been manifested apart from the law. It sounds like the gospel runs contrary to the law. But what we're working with here is the reality that you are justified apart from the law, but the law points you to it. Similarly, chapter 3, verse 27, what happens in respect to our boasting? It is excluded by what kind of law? By a law of works? No, but by a law of faith. We hold that one is justified by faith apart from the works of the law. Chapter 4, verse 13, the adherents of the law. If the adherents of the law are to be heirs, then faith is null and the promise is void. Again, it sounds like the law is running contrary to the gospel. Verse 15, the law brings wrath. Where there is no law, there is no transgression. That's my idea, just so that I was saying a little bit earlier, that what is the nature of the law? It makes your violation very clear. And then the statement that we're just looking at, sin was indeed in the world before the law was given. And here, finally, I think this is really programmatic and gives us a good interpretational grid for all of it. The law came in to increase the trespass. Where sin increased, grace abounded all the more. I'll return to this idea later, but here I think is the richness of the idea, and this was just something that came together for me while I was working on this for today, is to appreciate that the law, I can orient the law, or orient my understanding of the law within the same framework that we use for all of biblical theology, really, thinking across the Old Testament. So I'm working right now through the Old Testament together with my son. We do this daily reading, and I give him assigned passages as we go along, and then we talk through it each day. And we will hit different figures. Right now we're with David. And how do I explain this? He's 7. How do I explain David in respect to the whole picture of biblical theology? The answer goes, I'm going to highlight with my son. There are elements of David's reign that are positive, and in that they point to Christ. They adumbrate. I mean, they point out the shadow. They cast a shadow that points you to Christ. Kind of the general outline, adumbrating. The kind of the sense of it. Just give just, instead of a clear picture, it's just kind of a sketch. Okay, And so if I'm looking at David, I just see the kind of the fuzzy sketch, okay, of a person. But it's not clear, right? It's just a general kind of idea. Hazy. Okay. David ends up adumbrating or giving me a hazy picture that points to the Messiah, because I'm seeing here the picture of a king, a righteous king. And I can do the same thing with Solomon. I can see a righteous king with David. I can see a wise king with Solomon. You can do this same kind of logic with Moses, because you're going to see a prophet, right? And you have the Deuteronomy notion of the prophet who is greater than me. So you can do this with a priest. You can see, like, I think particularly of Samuel as a paradigmatic priest, but Melchizedek, all of the sacrificial system, all of the sacrifices. Okay, all of these things are giving you this hazy kind of picture in general, shadowy terms of the Messiah. But they do that both positively, because they point to what the Messiah will be like. So that's the adumbrating concept, kind of the shadowy concept. Both positively, and here's critically, also negatively. Right? Because in the process of seeing David, I see that he's righteous, but I also see that he's not righteous. In the process of seeing Solomon, I see that he's wise, and at times he's foolish. In the case of Moses, I see that he's a prophet, I see that he's a mediator, but I also see that he fails. In the case of the priests, I see that they are able to make intercession, and they are able to bring sacrifices, but the sacrifices fail. So you see what I mean? In each one of these cases, I've got both positive and negative. There's a positive sense in which each one of these persons or each one of these accounts or these details, they do adumbrate, they point to, in general, sketchy terms, what the Messiah is going to look like. But they're also negative in that every case they fall short. And it has the effect, when you put all that together, both positive and negative simultaneously, of pointing ultimately to Jesus as the one who absolutely is the fulfillment of all of that. The thing that just helped me personally processing the law was to appreciate both that positive and negative component with the law. So the positive component of this is that the law does point people to what righteousness is and what they need to do. There are these statements, right? Leviticus states it, and then Paul quotes it in Romans. I have the references in here later. I can find it for you. But so these commands, if you do them, you shall live by them. I mean, there is this idea that if you're going to have relationship with God, you must be righteous. Matthew 5:48, you must therefore be perfect, even as your heavenly Father is perfect. If you want relationship with God, you must be righteous. And one of the ideas we're going to hit in Romans 8 is that part of the purpose of salvation is truly to bring about real and significant righteousness in the lives of people. So our salvation and our sense of the gospel is not strictly just forensic. It's not just God declares us righteous and then we're done. But it is also practical and lived out, right? Ephesians 2, we are his workmanship created in Christ Jesus unto good works, which God before ordained that we should walk in them. Sorry, I just dropped something. That we are supposed to live out righteousness. And it's supposed to happen, practically speaking. The law points to that. And the law says to you that you ought to be living this out, or this should be happening. And yet at the same time, you have this very strong pattern that everybody fails, and the law cannot bring about that righteousness. It cannot effect that righteousness. So it's creating, just like the diagram over here, as I think of every other aspect of Old Testament biblical theology, if I just take, one aspect, I just pick the king, it creates both a positive hope. I have a sense of what a righteous king would look like. There's the positive. So it gives me a sense, this is what I want. This is what I long for. This is what I need. It also gives me a negative. David's not it. Solomon's not it. Right? And, you can just keep on going. Manasseh is definitely not it. Okay? So it gives you both the positive of what a righteous king would look like and the negative frustration that it's not happening. And those two together are just creating and increasing this thirst or this desire, this longing. When will that king come? And you can just go down the line with all of these, right? I mean, the priest, it's giving you a sense of what a righteous sacrifice would look like if it came. So it is filling in more and more and more details of the picture of what the Messiah would be. It's increasing the picture, and the clarity is growing at the very same time that the frustration is increasing over here, the negative side. You're frustrated because these priests continually fail. In the same way, the law is continually shading in for you what would righteousness mean, what would it look like to actually have this restored, even as it frustrates you because you can't keep it. You can't do it. And the richness of that theme, of course, as you come into the Gospels, I think particularly of Matthew, do not think that I came to abolish the law. I did not come to abolish, but to fulfill. If I'm thinking of the positive and the negative framework that I was talking about, these dual sides, I tend to visualize it like this, that the positive and the negative are both pointing in like arrows. Here's the positive. You need righteousness. You cannot come to God apart from righteousness. Here's the negative. Oh, but you can't. You are not capable of doing it. And those two together, along with the myriad other, the prophet, the priest, the king theme, all of these themes come together, and they find their fulfillment in him. So that Jesus says, I did not come to abolish the law, I came to fulfill the law. Jesus Christ keeps the law perfectly. Through Jesus Christ, he brings about righteousness so that his righteousness is given to all who are united with him. And the result of that then is that they walk righteously, which is just gloriously beautiful. They actually end up living out Christ-likeness. They end up living out the very thing that the law describes. Okay, so I give that partly as things that I wanted to talk about in respect to the law, but also to fill out the fullness of where we're going in talking about chapters 7 and 8. There's another thought we could put in here, but I think I'll skip it for now, and then if we have time, we could talk about that. If there are any questions there, happy to talk about them. I definitely would say David points to Jesus. Abraham points to Jesus. I read when I'm astounded, actually, as I'm reading the Old Testament together with my son, and I'm just making this link for him. I'm astounded how consistently this pattern comes up. Anyway, we interpret through this lens. It's so much richer than doing a be like David, don't be like David, be like Solomon, don't be like Solomon. That's fine. You can do a little of that here and there. And the New Testament does some of that. So I'm not saying you can't ever. We learn lessons. But still, it's so much richer to look at this. And we just finished up David together. Okay, the first part of his reign and the hope of that. Yay, Israel has a righteous king. And then the Bathsheba incident and everything just falls apart. And you end it with sadness. Oh, he's not a righteous king. And this is the best it's going to get, right? He's like the high point. It just increases your hunger and your longing for the Messiah to come. So yes, definitely that's the way I would read that. Okay, let me go then. Let's start jumping into some of the specifics of chapter 7, and I'll start with structure of chapter 7. So if I was going to, I'll show it to you here. If I was going to give the structure of chapter 7, I would do something like this. The core question being, how do I make this bigger? I don't remember. There it is. Great. Okay. So structure of chapter 7, verses 1 to 6, opening illustration that death ends our relationship to the law. Verses 7 to 12, is the law itself sin? Verses 13 to 25, did the law become the cause of our death? Let me substantiate that structure by just pointing out a couple of explicit structural components that are in the chapter. So you can see this indicated by the, what shall we say then? So here, verses 1 to 7 or 1 to 6 are explicit enough just because that's just the opening illustration. But then my marker here is, what shall we say then, and I use the X, by no means, may it never be. And the same thing if you go to the next, you have another question, verse 13. Did that which is good then bring death to me? By no means. Okay, so those two are explicit structural markers, and that's just the outline I'm using. So I have three components or three sections. First section is, I'll make this a little bigger so it's clear. First section is here, right? And then the next section is just marked off by that structural marker. What should we say then? Which is to say he's raising a question. And the third section is raised by that structural marker. You can subdivide that a little bit, and I'll show you. You can subdivide this third section down a little bit more. But I do think basically it's those questions that are controlling or defining things. Let me talk about those questions for a second. The may it never be pattern, or the by no means pattern. So it is interesting, I think, to track out what's going on if you want to watch his flow across the book, where this happens, because you're going to find that these questions are spread out across the book, enough so that you can definitely see a pattern that this is, I'd say, a structural marker for the argument of the book overall. So here, I'll show this to you in terms of a graph. Here we go. So just so you know, the height of the graph is not a relevant part of it. This is just dropped in there. I'm basically just dropping it in there so that you can see the markers that are happening across it. And what you can see is that they come at significant points across the flow of the book, but they're spread out enough. You've got two of them here early in chapter 3. You've got, I think, just one in chapter 4. You've got one in chapter 6, 2 in chapter 7, and then again in chapter 9, and 2 more in chapter 11. And I think that's interesting. It's kind of showing you that a lot of his framework or his structure of the book is built around questions. So he's doing that kind of like a lawyer framework. Okay, so you're going to move to the next question. You're going to address that question. He's not always doing it in that discussion, but enough that you can see it as a pattern. And if you wanted to look at the specific examples of that or what it looks like, then you get this. So actually, I'll give you context here so you can see just the question that is raised. So the question goes, oops, I need one more. The question goes, so what if some were unfaithful? Does that faithfulness nullify the faithfulness of God? By no means. Next example here. If our righteousness serves to show the righteousness of God, does that mean God is unrighteous to inflict wrath? By no means. If then we see God justifying the circumcised by faith, the uncircumcised through faith, do we overthrow the law? By no means. What should we say then? Are we to continue in sin so that grace may abound? By no means. And here, are we to sin because we are not under law but under grace? By no means. The two questions that we have in our section, what should we say then? The law is sin? By no means. And the next section here, did that which is good then bring death to me? No way. Absolutely not. Just a couple of more of these. Romans 9:14. Is there injustice on God's part? By no means is that true. Has God rejected his people? Absolutely not. Did they stumble in order that they might fall? Absolutely not. And the pattern, if you're looking for a pattern with these, there are a lot of different questions, but they're going to be basically around two major loci. And one is in respect to law and sin. So is Paul's gospel creating antinomianism? I think that's probably the major pattern, the most significant pattern for the whole first section of these, all the way up through chapter 7. Questions like, does that mean that the law is sin? Does that mean that the law produces sin in us? Maybe as a subcategory in there would be the goodness of the law. And then the other category in chapter 9 moving forward is basically around the locus, have God's purposes failed? And again, you can go through and pull these questions out if you want, and I think you'll see those are the two loci for this, it's helpful if these are the programmatic questions for the book that kind of structure the book and drive the flow of the argument. That means they're pretty important parts of the discussion. And that means if you track them, you're actually seeing what are the big issues or the central core questions in the first part of the book and the second part of the book. And the answer goes that. Chapters 1 through 8, basically a question of the law and sin. And how then do we understand it bringing about righteousness? And chapters 9 and following have God's purposes failed, particularly in respect to his covenant promises to his people. So anyway, I think that helps me kind of track what's going on or what is the center of some of this. Only thing I'll say there other than that, you I think know, the King James will translate this God forbid. A lot of the modern translations will say by no means. The most literal, which I don't know, maybe the NAS does this, but a very literal reading of it would be something like may it never be. And it is, it's almost, if we did Tagalog here, it is almost like a huwag sana. The structure of it is like a wish or a possibility kind of concept, and then he's saying no. So may that absolutely, I would never want it to be that way. Absolutely not. But it's really hard to bring across into English. I just looked, and yes, the NAS does may it never be, and that's probably, it's a little wooden. So NAS, it's a little wooden, but it says it fairly literally. So that's kind of the idea underneath. Okay, I'm not seeing any questions, and I won't wait for them. If you have questions, just drop them in, please. But I'll keep on going. Here, chapter 7 now, I'm going to get into more of the specifics of chapter, or start working on some of the specifics of chapter 7. You have a reference to the law, and there is throughout a pattern here with the law that can be used in more of a broad way. We're going to see it again in chapter 8 even more strongly. But sometimes the law will be used, it'll be translated like principle. And I think actually the NAS at least translates it that way. So I have a law, or I notice a law within me. And it's used as, here is like a principle idea. I'm arguing around or throughout here that I'm looking for this to truly be the Mosaic law. I prefer not to go into that metaphorical use of that word. So here's an example of that. I find this to be, some of the translations I think will do, I find this to be a principle. Let me see if the NAS actually does this. Yeah, there it is, 721. I find then the principle that evil is present in me, the one who wants to do good. I'm going to prefer to argue that it is actually the law. I find this law, and this actually referring to the Mosaic law throughout. So I'll try to substantiate that, particularly at the beginning of chapter 8, where you see that. But I say that in order to say this idea. The whole argument or concern of chapter 7 is deeply focused on the law. The question of particularly the goodness of the law. Is the law good? Remember I said there are these two, the structural components in chapter 7 are specifically these questions, the may it never be questions. Well, let's just take a look at both of those. And if you look at both of the two questions I have in the section that may it never be kind of format, that are the programmatic structural questions of the section, watch what they are. What then shall we say, get rid of this, what shall we say that the law is sin? And down here, did that which is good bring death to me? And you can see with both of those questions, the core issue of the chapter is the law good? Can we defend the goodness or the rightness of the law? You can do a similar search if you just roll through this section and you look for law or commandments. And it's absolutely a massive theme here. So let me show it to you. I highlighted it over here just so it's visually more apparent if you're reading through. What you're looking for is the blue underline. And if you're watching for that blue underline, you're going to see law, written code, commandment, commandments. all the way through. I mean, a very strong pattern in this chapter. I think statistically more often in this chapter than any other chapter in Romans on the issue of the commandment or the law. And that becomes something, I'll touch back on this in a bit, that becomes important for our interpretation here, because Romans 7 is so often oriented around the question of who is the I, who is the person in the middle of the chapter, where Paul continually goes through this issue. I was under the law, I struggled with the law, and then it was the result of that sin in me. And we go into an endless discussion around this. Is this referring to a believer or an unbeliever? And we orient our whole discussion around that. I would just like to put on the front end here to recognize at the very beginning, front end, that the main concern of Romans 7 is the law and the role of the law. What is the law? Is it good? What is it supposed to do? And not really so much focused on the question we're usually asking, which is the person in Romans 7 a believer or an unbeliever? Okay, before I do that, though, let me talk about the illustration just at the beginning, 7:1 and following, and we should read it, so let's do that first. Romans 7:1, do you not know, brothers, for I am speaking to those who know the law. By the way, that doesn't mean he's only speaking to Jews. It's the assumption, I think, that some of his listeners, even Gentile listeners, are familiar with the law. That the law is binding on a person only as long as he lives, for a married woman is bound by law to her husband while he lives. But if her husband dies, she is released from the law of marriage. Accordingly, she will be called an adulteress if she lives with another man while her husband is alive. But if her husband dies, she is free from that law. If she marries another man, she is not an adulteress. There's a lot of complex discussion that happens in this, different views of what the law, what the husband represents, what the wife represents, and how that all works out. And this is probably a rabbit trail, but you can do it kind of like this chart. I'll just put it up here if you want to take a screenshot of it, or I can also share this into the Google Classroom later. But here's part of the problem that you have is that here's the illustration, the woman, the man, the law. The law is what bind, or what defines or constrains. The woman and the man, they're married. The law constrains that. So the man dies, the law is set aside. I put a mark here. The man is dead. That means the law that binds them is no longer operative. Okay, but the problem here, and the reason that this kind of breaks down, is that his argument is that the believer has died. And now, okay, so the picture of it, the woman and the man are married, the man dies, the woman is now free. So the woman is free to marry a new husband. And the believer is free, or is in relationship now to Christ. In other words, it's just kind of, anyway, I don't want to go down the rabbit trail too much, but however you configure the details, if you say like the woman represents us, but the man represents the law, or the man represents the Old Testament, or however you do it, it doesn't work out right. And I think that's for two reasons. Number one, I don't think Paul really intends for us to pinpoint, and this is a biblical interpretation idea, but it's not really intended for us to do a point by point. This equals, this equals, this equals. That's a bad way to do interpretation in these kinds of places anyway. His actual point is just to illustrate that death cancels the requirement, or death cuts the relationship to the law like that. And he's just drawing that from the picture of marriage. The law is no longer operative. What would have been an absolute moral standard is cut because a person died. And his link from that goes backwards into chapter 6, which is the whole idea that we died with Christ. That's the link here. So we did die. We died with Christ, and that means our relationship to the law is severed. So let me finish reading the section because I stopped there. Romans 4. Likewise, my brothers, you also have died to the law through the body of Christ, your union with Christ. That union with Christ, remember, that's linked back to chapter 6. We died with Christ, we rose with Christ. Death and resurrection with Christ. So you also have died to the law through the body of Christ, so that you may belong to another, to him who has been raised from the dead, in order that we may bear fruit for God. While we were living in the flesh, our sinful passions aroused by the law were at work in our members to bear fruit for death. Now we are released from the law, having died to that which has held us captive, so that we serve in the new way of the Spirit and not in the old way of the written code. My first reason then is that the whole point of this illustration up here, it's not really to give like a one-for-one correspondence, this equals that, this equals that. It's just not even the point of all of this. The point of all of this is just simply to illustrate that death cuts the relationship to the law. And you get down here and that's it. You have died to the law by your connection or your association with Christ. By your union with Christ, your relationship to the law is cut. Okay, but there's another reason that you don't want to do a one-for-one correspondence. Oh, I should say first, by the way, I'm sorry. In order to make this, the nice thing about this, in order to make this very, very clear, the point of this entire illustration is explicitly stated in verses 4 and 5. That's the key. It's helpful, right? When Jesus gives his parable and then he says, okay, here's my interpretation of it. That's what Paul essentially gives you here. Verses 4 and 5 are the interpretation of that, so that you know how to connect the two together. And therefore, we don't have to scrap around and guess, what is this? And he tells you how far he wants to take the illustration. Okay, but the other reason that this illustration breaks down and that you wouldn't want to try to seek out a one-for-one correspondence type of thing is that by definition, our condition or our relationship with Christ cannot be illustrated by any human illustration. And the reason is it involves both our death and our resurrection, right? In other words, the framework of the illustration, and as it's explained down here in verse 4, you have died in respect to the law, but you also have been raised from the dead together with him, right? And so in order to come up with like a human illustration for this, you'd have to talk about a spouse who dies, but then the person is resurrected. Anyway, it just doesn't work. Right? That's the thing, is that in order to illustrate our reality, the point he's making is so grand and so glorious that there's no possible human illustration that could represent it. So some commentators will go in here, I mean liberal commentators will go in here and say, yeah, Paul's illustration, it broke down. He worked himself into a dead end. And no, there's no dead end or mistake here as though his illustration was inferior. You can't possibly represent it with any human reality. That's how grand the reality of it is. So specifically, if we were going to say this in this framework, specifically, the problem is how someone could both die, severing the old relationship, and go on to marry another, which looks ahead to the promise of the resurrection in chapter 8. We're united with Christ in both his death and his resurrection, both of them together. And so in Schreiner's words, actually he's quoting someone else, no analogy could perfectly express what Paul wanted to communicate, since he describes a unique event in which a believer dies and yet continues to live. That shows us how complex our salvation is. It shows that our condemnation under the rightful jurisdiction of the law could not be broken apart from God's word. God removed us from the righteous jurisdiction of the law by causing us to die in Christ. It was necessary to die in order to be free of the law. But that was also bringing about the benefits of life, which is resurrection. Okay, I think that's it on that part of the illustration. Let me talk about this, though. You see in verse 4, and we'll come around to an idea of like this, if we have time, in chapter 8. You just see the comment here, so that you may belong to another, in order that we may bear fruit for God. And I won't develop or explain beyond just that, but you can go through a broad set of passages all across Scripture looking for this fruit notion. You're going to find very, very strongly the idea that Scripture expects, it's part of the core of salvation, not just that we have a forensic problem resolved, but that we live out practical righteousness, that we live out significant, recognizable, identifiable righteousness that is supposed to be a core part of how we live out our lives. All right, one other idea that I am going to hit here is just alluded to or just introduced to us in verse 5. And so this is the time, I think, to talk about it. Verse 5, for while we were living in the flesh, our sinful passions aroused by the law were at work in our members to bear fruit for death. If you keep on going with the flesh, to my memory, this is the first time it's been introduced to us. But you're going to get it again here. I know that nothing good dwells in me, that is in my flesh. Gives you the impression of like a subcategory. If you do the Venn diagram, here's me, and then within that, here's my flesh. Kind of the diagram that we were doing over here. Oops, wrong diagram. Gives you the impression that the flesh is a subset of me, and therefore, me, I'm innocent, but then the flesh is like the bad part of me or something. I want to talk about that and explain what we're seeing here. But if you keep on going with the flesh, you're going to get it strongly in chapter 8. What God has done what the law weakened by the flesh could not do. And so we talk about people who walk not according to the flesh, but according to the Spirit, those who live according to the flesh, set their minds on the things of the flesh. And you're just watching the orange here. If you just keep on going with the orange, I think that's it, yeah. But it's very strong across chapter 8, Romans 8. So I do want to talk for a second about what is the flesh, or what that means. To do that, I'm relying here on the dictionary of Paul and his letters, and I'm just looking at the entry on flesh. And anyway, it's helpful. I'm not saying it's necessarily a source, run out and buy it right away. There's other sources I would recommend if in your priority purchase, but anyway, it's useful. So here's what I was drawing from that. He goes through and gives 6 different kinds or 6 different categories. Basically, he's doing a quasi-lexical theological analysis. And he's just going to recognize flesh, the word sarx, can be used as physical matter, as in flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God. The human body, as a person becomes one flesh with her, so it's like a marriage context, or I think actually that's a context Paul talking about a prostitute. The human race, by the works of the law, no flesh will be justified, so that just refers to like humanity and the amalgam. A morally neutral sphere, kind of describing a race of blood relatives. So you see here in Romans, Jesus Christ is descended from David according to the flesh. It's not really intended to be tied into morals or ethics. It's just in Tagalog we would say, kanyang lahi. It's like what is his descent or something. The morally negative sphere, almost functioning like the world. I put no confidence in the flesh. And that's really close to our idea, but slightly different. And so then this 6th sense is the one that we're talking about, rebellious human nature, the nature of humanity as broken. So here, a couple of points about that. More than half of the occurrences of this appear in Romans, especially Romans 8. Romans 8 is kind of the classic locus of it. I mean, Romans 8 is really where it's all at. The rest of them appear in Galatians 4:6, and then a couple of references scattered about, depending on how you want to interpret them. Actually, these are, they're not super clear examples of flesh in this sense. You do see a very strong idea of the flesh in this sense contrasted with the Spirit. And I can show you that here in Romans 8. You can just see this visually. So you have the orange here that I was talking about earlier as the flesh. Well, then I did blue as the Spirit. And you can just see it's flesh, spirit all the way through. Very strongly so. And if you just, I won't go there, but if you just mentally think or put your mind towards Galatians 5, the works of the flesh versus the works of the Spirit, or the fruit of the Spirit. So, I mean, it's there as well in Galatians very strongly, that the same contrast is happening there. This is a bit more in the, minutia direction, a little bit of, nerdy minutia stuff. But it's interesting. It's almost always used with the article. And it's nearly every case where flesh is either a subject or a direct object. I think because flesh in this sense is being used not just as an abstract, but almost like a concrete thing almost. And the concept does not appear in the Septuagint or really in the New Testament outside of Paul, though I'll show you some examples that maybe fit. It does appear in some of the Qumran documents, but anyway, for what it's worth. It seems like largely it was almost unprecedented. It almost seems like it's a Pauline, like very much Pauline thing. That's taken from that article I just mentioned. If you go to BDAG, I went to the BDAG entry for this and I just pulled out all the references. BDAG groups it a little wider, and so they're going to use examples like this: the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. See, I think the other source would view this as just kind of like your physical body is weak. Anyway, if that's the case, if you want to group this in the ethical sarx idea with BDAG, then okay, you have some non-Pauline examples. And then you have a ton of Pauline examples. I'm going to skip these because we're right in the middle of those. But if you come past those Romans examples, here you have a few more. Do I make plans according to the flesh? See, I don't know that I would group it that way. But maybe grouping it as ethical sarx. Here, the Galatians, having begun by the Spirit, are you now being perfected by the flesh? Very clearly here, walk by the Spirit, you will not gratify the desires of the flesh. I mean, that's very explicit, spirit, flesh, and it's very clear that we're talking about this ethical sense, the thing that's broken about us kind of idea. We all once lived in the passions of our flesh. That could be the physical body, because you see, carrying out the desires of the body and the mind. Or you could view it in terms of like the ethical kind of sense here. And then I'm going to skip up here for sake of time. Here's the only other non-Pauline example, if I remember right, 2 Peter, speaking loud boasts of folly, they entice by sensual passions of the flesh, those who are barely escaping from those who live in error. So anyway, there might be some non-Pauline examples of it. In any case, what does it refer to? It's clear because just the way Paul uses it, it's not a Gnostic thing. You remember my opening question here, I'm bothered a little bit if you kind of have an idea like the body is bad, and so try to live more in the spiritual realm or something, this idea over here. I'm not happy with that idea at all, this framework. So it's clear if you look at Paul's usage, he will talk about the body and in the physical frame in a positive way. It's not just that he has some kind of idea, a dualism like that. A helpful framework for understanding the whole and interpreting the whole notion for this, I find Galatians 2 or Galatians 3. Let me ask you, did you receive the Spirit by works of the law or by hearing with faith? Are you so foolish, having begun by the Spirit, or are you now being perfected by the flesh? I find this helpful because I think there is overlap between the ethical sense of the flesh and the sense of strength, or even body, in the sense of like, maybe to put this in an English idiom, are you doing this by flexing your muscles? Are you doing this by your own strong arm? Having begun by the Spirit, are you now going to do this by your own efforts? And I think that's the sense of flesh right here. But it does show you that there's significant overlap here. In other words, a sense of self-reliance and your own strength exposes the brokenness and the corruption that is within us. So the contrast then becomes righteousness by one's own strength and effort versus righteousness accomplished by the Spirit. That distinction, I think, elucidates a lot for me and helps me go where I want to go here. At the same time, another really interesting pattern for this is to realize or recognize there's a pattern between the flesh and resurrection. So let me show you that example, or that conceptual link again in Romans 8, verses 9 and following. So you, however, are not in the flesh, but in the Spirit. If anyone does not have the Spirit, he does not belong to him. Verse 10, if Christ is in you, though the body is dead because of sin. And I think the framework for this is, like our physical bodies are decaying, or we're getting worse with time. But our internal is our spirit, the spirit of God, but more than that, is being renewed. You remember this concept in 2 Corinthians, right? Though our outward body decays, our inward man is being renewed day by day. That kind of notion. Why? Ultimately eschatological. If the spirit of him who raised Jesus from the dead dwells in you, he who raised Christ Jesus from the dead will also, it's future, give life to your mortal bodies through his spirit who dwells in you. So the richness of this, I think, is there is the distinction between my physical body is falling apart because the work of God in saving me has begun with the invisible. But it is the future eschatological resurrection, and this is critical, that will also ultimately give life to my mortal body. So it's not that my mortal body is bad. My mortal body will be resurrected. It's just that for the time being, my salvation and my victory is expressed primarily in aspects of me that I can't see, right? It's expressed in it's expressed in my spirit, and it's expressed in the spiritual component of me. Eschatologically, then it will be expressed when my physical body basically catches up with the rest of me. My physical body is resurrected. And so there is a component of this that is salvation history focused. It's focused pointing forward into an eschatological kind of idea. So I don't know if that helps any, but to kind of summarize what's going on here, I would say the two primary links are flesh in the sense of your personal strength. Trying to bring about salvation by your own strength is not going to work. So Paul contrasts that, your personal self-won righteousness, with the Spirit. It's a strong contrast there. Secondarily, with this kind of eschatological focus, that my physical body, my flesh, will eventually be resurrected, but for the time being, it is indeed falling apart day by day. Okay, so I think I'm past the time to take a break. Where we're going to go when we get back is to jump into the next section, Romans 7 to 12, and work through the rest of that chapter. In the process, we'll get into the thicket and impossibly complicated question of what is the I, or who is the I in chapter 7. Is that unbeliever? Is that a believer? Is it something else? So that's the plan there. Let's come back. I've got 7 minutes after the hour, so can we come back at, we'll just say 13 minutes after the hour, and that way I'm making sure I give you the full 5 minutes. So come back at 13 minutes after the hour and pick up there. I should say, and I forgot about this, but if you read up through Romans 8, you're going to see the flesh talked about in terms of having its own desires, in having its own thinking. And that again is the argument. I don't want to really separate this off as though, okay, here, you do the Venn diagram, here's me, and then here's the flesh. The flesh, it's all of me. There is a particular component of it that's talking about the reality of my physicality, that I'm limited in that sense, but it's all of me. And you really don't want to have, there's the good part of me and the bad part of me, the two dogs within me that are struggling. It's more basic than that. It's me versus the Spirit of God, and it's the Spirit of God regenerating, changing, transforming me. But it's not really that I have then these two inside of me that are struggling within me. I don't think that's a good framework for sanctification at all. So that's that. I'll move then to the next section, and that's Romans 7 through 12. And I don't think I can read it just for sake of time, but I'll put it on the screen and we'll kind of read it. The question clearly is the law sin? Is the law negative, or is it bad? I think this is important. So particularly as Protestants, and as dispensationalists, then we can read the law and view it as the enemy. It's very important to push that back. The law is not our problem. The law is good. And you're going to have that statement here. So, of course, by no means, we're not going to say that the law is evil. I would not have known sin otherwise. I would have not known the law not to covet. It was sin that took advantage of the commandment and produced in me all of this kind of destruction. So when the commandment came, sin came alive and I died. I don't think here, I would want to be careful here. I was once alive apart from the law. There are two different ways you can resolve that. You can understand that in terms of like, I thought I was okay. And then once the commandment became clear, then I realized I'm not okay. Another way to just do that is kind of in the hypothetical sense. Everybody has the law in the conscience. So in that sense, all of us then, if hypothetically, if you were kind of apart from the law, then you could be okay. But chapter 1 and chapter 2, all of us have the law. Therefore, all of us stand condemned. In any case, it's not like biographically speaking, there's a period of Paul's life where he's unfallen, like a Pelagian kind of framework. But the very commandment that promised life proved to be death to me. Sin taking an opportunity through the commandment deceived me, and through it killed me. Twice he said this kind of language. It was sin seizing an opportunity through the commandment. The distinction then is that sin is the ultimate cause. The commandment is the instrumental cause, or the commandment is the thing that sin takes advantage of, kind of the channel by which it works. But the reality, the core reality of the problem is sin itself. And this is just, it's critical for us to maintain so that we don't go, you can go down a set of track. The law was given by Moses, grace and truth were realized by Jesus Christ. You can go down a track like this with a kind of at the extreme of dispensationalism. And so grace and truth were realized by Jesus Christ. Therefore, the law is not gracious and the law is not true almost. That's not stated there. Here it is very, very clear. The law is holy. The commandment is holy, righteous, and good. So we ought to be grateful for it. I was preaching, I don't remember what the context was, but I was preaching through some of these themes. And so the method I used, I took the Psalms where the author just says, I delight in the law. The law is my delight. I'm grateful for it, and this kind of thing. So I kind of changed the language up so that people wouldn't recognize it as explicitly biblical. And then you just read that out, and someone, I'm so glad for the law. I love the law. God's commands, or the 10 Commandments, are wonderful, and I'm so glad that God gave us the law. Somebody goes, oh, really? I thought the law was bad. It just kind of catches your attention a little bit, and it, I think, exposes maybe I'm dispensationalist, but a little bit of a dispensational excess if we turn the law into an evil thing that we need to escape. We don't need to escape it, but sin takes advantage of it, and it's particularly our brokenness that's expressed in our relationship to the law. The emphasis, of course, is that the law makes sin clear. It clarifies the standard, kind of my idea earlier. When I say to my child, I give them an absolute clear, here it is. Now it's transgression if they step over it. Another just reminder here is to affirm again and remember that the core concern of this whole passage is not psychology. By that I mean like analyzing Paul's internal processing, or the question that we're about to go to, which is the question of whether it's Paul is a believer or an unbeliever. But it's explicit here, and you can see right in the passage it's built in here. He tells you the issue of his discussion, what he's discussing here, and we have to maintain this as we read it, is the goodness of the law. That's the core question of it. So it's really focused on the law and not the internal psychology of Paul. And that here, with that initial statement, am I saying that the law is sin? No, the commandment is holy and righteous and good. And what Brother Kenneth commented about here, excellent. We know that the law is spiritual, right? It's a positive. It's a good. That's the core of the discussion and what he's processing in here. One other thing or comment to make in here that's interesting, it's not accidental that the particular law he's talking about here is you shall not covet. Reason being, people can make themselves think that they have managed to keep, the murder law. Okay, I've not committed adultery, I've been faithful to my wife. I've not stolen, I've not lied. That's going to be a little tougher. Most people in their lives have failed in those respects in some way. And you can go further with that, and you can recognize, as Jesus explains, that things like even the adultery law is internal. Have you ever looked at a person? Murder is about hatred. Have you hated somebody in your heart? Well, that you're denying the image of God. You're rejecting the image of God. And you can do this with each one of the commands. No other gods besides me. Well, I mean, Colossians applies idolatry in respect to this with covetousness. Okay, so you can be idolatrous by just loving stuff. So anyway, the point stands very strongly that all of the commands are internalized, and Jesus does that in Matthew 5. Still, this command is the most obvious and explicitly internal. You should not even desire. And it's not accidental, I think, that it's the 10th command. It's kind of a capstone command. So the last in the flow of thought. If you somehow made yourself think that you have managed to keep all the other commands, here's the last one. You shouldn't even want things that are not rightfully yours, right? And that's going to kill you. So it's not intentional here it's not unintentional here that is the specific command that he highlights here. Nobody is going to escape that one. In the next section, which is verse 13 down to 25, there are some subsections here that I marked. This is not as big a deal, but structurally speaking, I think there's a subsection here in verse 14. And the reason that I think it's identifiable that way, for we know. Again, down here in verse 18, for I know. And verse 21, so I find it to be a law. So I think that's plausible enough. Each one of them has this kind of inferential for, and then the I know, we find kind of gives the impression of a summary sort of idea. So anyway, those are plausibly subsections within this larger section. The strong pattern across this whole section is that the law is not our problem. Here, though, this is a rich framework, I think. The law is not our problem, nor is it our solution. It highlights and exposes both our desperate situation, and it points us to the true answer. The law is not the problem we need to escape. The law is also not able to solve the problem for us, but it points to where the answer lies. And you can get that clearly, like in Galatians 4, the law is our schoolmaster to point us to Christ. That was my concept here earlier. I'm just saying it in different words, but this concept that we went over talking about the law in respect to the whole framework for Old Testament theology. Okay, that framework, that's what I mean. The law is not our problem, it's a positive thing, but it also is not our solution. Jesus is the fulfillment. And so to get this, you're going to have to go to him. The role of the law, our need for it, highlights the depth of our problem. And here's what I mean by that. When Paul says, I was once alive apart from the law, then sin came and I died. Or the law highlighted his failure. I think what that shows you, and it's again the concept of the goodness of the law, Paul was already guilty independent of it. I was already guilty. Whether I ever read the Ten Commandments or whether I ever appreciate the depth of the Ten Commandments or not, I stand guilty, fact. But I think the existence of the law and the graciousness of the law, that God graciously shows us his standard of holiness, it highlights the depth of my problem. My problem is not just my sin, it is even more than that. I don't even get that I'm sinning. That's my problem. I'm guilty, but I don't even understand how guilty. Here's the worst expression of it, the ultimate expression of it. I simultaneously am guilty and wicked, and I think I'm okay. That's awful. And the graciousness of the law is it steps in and says, hey, stupid, you're not okay, right? Hey, really? Really? You think you're okay? Oh my, wow. Okay, here's the law. And it's God's graciously showing me that I have a problem. It exposes that my problem is not only ethical, but it's also noetic and evaluative. Right? It exposes that I not only have a sin problem, but I have a thinking problem. I not only have a moral problem, I have a moral evaluation problem. Because not only am I bad, but I'm also really bad at understanding how bad I am. Schreiner says, one cannot fully comprehend the depth of sin in oneself, meaning you need the law to help you understand or appreciate what is wrong with you, why you're in trouble. I said it earlier that some of the translations will do the law as they'll do it as principle. So here, let me just show you what I mean by that. Some of the translations here, so I find it to be a principle or a pattern. And I took a class on Romans, 10 years ago or something, and I was taught this. So I find it to be a principle that when I want to do right. Schreiner translates this instead as accusative of reference, and so he'll translate it. So I find in reference to the law, or regarding the law, I find that when I want to do right, evil lies close at hand. I like that because I prefer to not have the law. The thing that always bothered me is the inconsistency that we're translating law as Mosaic, and then suddenly we jump out here. Maybe Paul is kind of playing with the polysemous nature of the word, that it can either refer to the Mosaic law or a principle. But I think there are ways exegetically to work it, and Mu goes the way with the principle and the metaphorical use. I kind of prefer to stick with the Mosaic law. So anyway, maybe I'm going down too many details, and that may not be helpful, but that's the way I would prefer to read that. And if you have questions about that, there's more detail that I'm skipping. Let me talk about two questions here, and that might just eat up the rest of our time. But the first question, I need to resolve this, which I've not really, I don't think, answered yet fully. The diagram that we talked about, or the problem I talked about, is there kind of a sub part of me, as though here's the main part of me that's good, and then there's a sub part of me that's bad or something. And the problem being, it gives the impression that our fallenness resides in only a particular part of us instead of the whole person. I think the key here is that sin, and the reason Paul uses this language when he says things like, it is not me that sin that dwells within me, that kind of language. The key here is that sin is probably viewed as an alien principle that destroys us from within. It's not that we are not ourselves guilty and sinful. We are, of course, guilty for everything we do. But it is the principle that the sin is, what do you say? The sin is like, it is a paradox. It is not the way human beings were supposed to be. It is an alien invader. It is a cancer. It's that kind of concept. It's a cancer that eats us out from within. And the concept, or the phrases I'm talking about that are somewhat problematic or troubling a little bit, are like verse 17 here. So it is now no longer I who do it, but sin that dwells within me. And down here, now if I do what I do not want, it is no longer I who do it, but sin that dwells within me. I mean, if you just think of somebody coming to you like in counseling, and they say to you, you find out they stole money, or they were involved, they lied or something like that. You say, so what's going on here? And they say, well, it wasn't, I'm a good guy. I didn't do it. It was sin dwelling in me that caused me to do this. You're like, really? Come on. No, that's not going to work. But that's almost what it sounds like he's saying. That's the problem, right? It almost sounds like Paul's saying, it's not me doing it, it's sin that dwells within me. And clarification you have to make here that I think is just interesting. This is a really interesting example of the role of systematic theology, that you have to read every statement in the context of the full body of biblical statements. He actually says right within the context that it is me doing it. So he's not denying that it is actually the him doing it. And Mu clarifies or qualifies here, I think, helpfully. The idea is that his failure is to put into action what he wills to do, shows that there is something besides himself involved in the situation. I like the metaphor of sin as cancer. There must be another actor in the drama. And so the question becomes why I am not living according to what I know I ought to be doing, why there is internal tension within my being. Anyway, yeah, I mean, it's clear that Paul's getting into, I mean, almost like it is an element of psychology, or kind of the tension within us, the recognition that within a human heart, there are things that are pulling you both directions. You do know what's right. You do know what you should be doing. And yet you realize that you're failing that. And my mind goes to apologetics. I'm really fascinated by the fact that humanity does have an assumption and awareness of moral standards. So I think, I don't remember if it was here or somewhere else, but I argue that if you talk to somebody and you say to them, yeah, I believe in unicorns. Really? Or I believe in the existence of even like spirit beings. Oh, really? But if you say to them, what do you think about the existence of God? I've never met somebody who looked back at me and said, no, what's that? They all have an idea in their heads of there being a God, at least the concept of it, even if they don't reject the concept of it. And same thing with morals. I just heard somebody talking about the breakdown of morals, and he just said in passing, and it was just the way the language came out. He just said, yeah, in our context or our society right now, to propose that there are clear moral rights and wrongs, that is the most opprobrious, rejected, and negative, like wrong thing you can possibly say. And I thought that was ironic, and the turn of phrase really captured it. That's exactly right. To say that there is a right and a wrong, people will look at that and say, what a wrong notion. They'll actually go further. It's almost like that's a wicked notion, because you can't squeeze the moral awareness out of people. They know that there is a right and a wrong. But it's more than that. People have built into their being awareness of sin and righteousness, but they also, I would argue, have a deep awareness that they have not lived up to their own standards. Right? I mean, they will at times, like, I'm a good person and such, but they also recognize on a deeper level, somewhere in there, all mixed in there together, that they are not what they should be. And if I look across at religion, world religion, historical religion, the pattern is very strong that we humans are acknowledging we have a problem related to morals, even that it's relational to some other being, and I need to do something about it. Okay, and I think you can walk through multiple different faiths and you can find that pattern, that we are aware that we have a problem. So I think that's something that is probably fitting into this, the sense that we are aware of a brokenness within us, and it's that brokenness that Paul's referring to as the flesh, like a cancer within, and the destructive effects of that. Okay, I think that's about as much as I can say. It's about as much as I'll go with that. The other question I want to talk about is a bigger and kind of, well, anyway, it's just a complex one. And that is the question of who is the I all the way through here. So let me show you the passage first so that we have it in our minds, and then kind of set up the problem a little bit. He's going to talk about struggle here. You're going to see a shift starting in verse 14, a shift of pronouns, and it's going to shift over to I. Okay, so we know that the law is spiritual, but I am of the flesh, sold under sin. I do not understand my own actions. I do not do what I want. I do the very thing I hate. If I do what I do not want, I agree with the law that it is good. It is no longer I who do it, but sin which dwells in me. For I know that nothing good dwells in me, that is in my flesh. I have the desire to do what is right, but not the ability to carry it out. I do not do the good I want, but the evil I do not want is what I keep on doing. If I do what I do not want, it is no longer I who do it, the sin that dwells within me. So I find a law, or in reference, I would read this. So I find that in reference to the law, when I want to do right, evil lies close at hand. I delight in the law of God in my inner being, but I see in my members another law, waging war against the law of my mind, making me captive to the law of sin that dwells in my members. Wretched man that I am, who will deliver me from the body of this death? The question is Paul a believer or an unbeliever? in the framework or how he's describing this. And if I'm going to go with the unbeliever side of things, the problem I have, if we're viewing Paul previous or pre-Christian, before conversion, the problem I have are questions like this. How does he delight in the law of God? How does he up here want to do this, right? So let's see. I do not do what I want, right? And so the idea is that he wants to follow God. He wants to do what is right. I have the desire to do what is right, but not the ability. I do not do the good I want, right? So, and here again, it's repeated. I do not want. So if you're talking about unbeliever, go back to chapter 3, and his argument is there's none who does good, no, not one. There's none righteous. There's none who seeks after God. There's none who understands. They do not desire to do good. And the idea of delighting in the law of God, no. That's the reason that the strongest pattern, and some people would just say straight up, this is it. The Reformed reading of this passage would say it has to be a believer. Because if you have a strong sense of total depravity, then you're going to say there's no way that this is an unbeliever who wants to do the will of God, who delights in the law of God. There's no way that you could do that. So like Bavinck is going to represent that, Calvin, Luther. The pattern very strongly across the Reformed perspective is going to be that this is a believer. Has to be, because how could an unbeliever delight in the law of God or want to do these things? The problem you have still is that you've got, so you go that direction, okay, it's a believer. If you go that direction, you've got other expressions that are really problematic in here. So things like this, evil lies close at hand. Okay, I guess you can work that out. But here, how would a believer be saying things like, who will deliver me from the body of this death? I am captive to the law of sin. Up a bit earlier, and I'm not sure if I'll find it quickly enough, but I am under sin, right? And the whole discussion throughout, sin that dwells within me, this is a believer, the whole discussion across sounds pretty grim. In fact, here, notice how striking it is. I am captive to the law of sin. Who will deliver me from the body of this death? Sin dwelling in me, I am under sin. Look at that in contrast to chapter 8. There is now no condemnation. Those who live according to the flesh set their minds in the flesh. Those who live according to the Spirit set their mind on the things of the Spirit. Down here, chapter 8 sounds so hopeful and so confident that if you are a believer, you will not walk in the ways of the flesh. And up here, chapter 7 is really grim. So either way you go, it's hard. It's complicated. And I'll show you some of the views that are articulated around this. So here these are just proposed or possible views that have been used. I'm taking this from an article in the Master's Journal, fall 2019. I'll give you the link in a little bit. It's a short article. It's an easy read. And he gives some of the proposed views that have been said. So Paul is a Christian. Paul is an unbeliever, particularly Jewish Pharisee lawkeeper type. The everyday Christian, an immature Christian. This is maybe the one that I hear sometimes in popular discourse that maybe bothers me the most. The idea that we're looking at the carnal versus the mature Christian. I find that I don't find that helpful at all. You can even do this as representing Adam or Israel. Then you can go general unbeliever or unbeliever becoming a believer. I think this is Lloyd Jones, I think, does this. What you're looking at is the process. Someone who's struggling, like a John Bunyan or an Augustine who's in the process of coming and they're struggling as a result. Jewish believer or Jewish unbeliever, so specifically that it's like a law keeper, a Pharisaical type. And then he himself is arguing that it's an Old Testament believer. So we're talking about a salvation history kind of idea. What follows here under evaluation, this is partly me, partly Schreiner, and I'm just mixing different arguments that I came across. I'm gonna skip it because it's a lot of content. But maybe I'll just highlight a few things for the believer side of it, the Christian experience. So this is a Christian for that view. They're going to argue that it's present tense. They're going to argue that Paul ends in verse 25, okay, I thank the Lord Jesus Christ who gives victory. If that's true, then why did he return back to kind of the negative? That argument actually cuts two different directions. But here, the core argument, I suspect, how could a believer desire to do God's law or rejoice in the law? And then who will rescue me? They're going to read that as eschatological future. So in verse 25, the conclusion, who will rescue me from this death? It's future and pointing then into the eschatological direction. They're also going to connect it with Galatians 5:16 and 18, the works of the flesh, the works of the spirit. And finally, an argument can be said that people experience something like this. And so maybe our experience points us this way. For the pre-Christian experience or unbeliever experience, the structure, there are some structural arguments you can do here. What convinces me the most on this point is the contrast I talked about a little bit earlier. Romans 8 is so hopeful. Romans 7 is so grim. So that contrast, I mean, to say that Romans 7 is a believer and then you move to Romans 8 and that's also a believer, that feels odd to me. And there is also a structural argument here that in the middle of chapter 7, you're kind of switching between. So there's no structural indicator that would say, okay, I just moved from unbeliever to believer. I should clarify, because the believer or the Reformed view would understand that it's an unbeliever up through 13. It's verse 14 to 25 only that refers to a believer. So you have to have a shift in there when there's no really exegetical argument in there. And that's related. Why would Paul shift from an unbeliever to a believer? These are just other details that I'm going to largely skip over. Okay. Oh, here. How are believers under sin? That's verse 14. I am of the flesh, sold under sin. I mean, that's a bothersome statement to be made of a believer. And finally, why is the Christian experience described here so distressing and bleak? Is that really there is now no condemnation? We have peace with God. It sounds very distressing all the way through. One or two things then that I would give as evaluative or just kind of explaining my conclusion on this. There is definitely an already not yet component of this, and I'll have to come back to that. But it is the idea that we are simultaneously enjoying some of the benefits of the future, even while we continue to struggle in the present. So, okay, there's a way to work it out like that. And I think there's definitely something there. But Schreiner will get to the end of all of this discussion, and he just says, the arguments on both sides are so strong, I'm not sure even what direction to go. And he kind of leaves it there. He doesn't really give a strong conclusive view on it. And he does, in a footnote I thought was helpful, he said he finds it baffling that some people, he mentions Gordon Fee, will just be so strong on their view that they'll say, hey, this is obvious. This is obviously a believer. And I would concur with that. If you read through the arguments and you're so convinced of your view, oh, this is definitely a believer, this is definitely an unbeliever, that you just write off the other view, I think you didn't appreciate the arguments, because the arguments are really strong in both directions, and it's a almost impossible to settle kind of question. It's just, the arguments go in both directions. So my argument would be, if the evidence is so impossible or so difficult to settle in either direction strongly, maybe that's intentional. I mentioned all those, I gave all those views up above, and if you look through the history of discussion, I'll give you a resource here that kind of gives a history of interpretation on it. You look through the history of this, and all of these views, this is not like a modern problem, all of these views have precedence. Maybe not all, some of the really odd ones maybe not. But basically all. have had some form all the way through church history. In other words, we've been struggling with this for 2,000 years, trying to figure out what's going on here. And we have a tendency to pen, okay, it's this or it's that. And maybe the whole concept, it's not really supposed to be that at all. It's just paradigmatically giving a generalized account of human experience. Here's the way I was trying to summarize it. If the evidence is impossible to definitively settle, perhaps Paul is giving a more generalized account of human experience when facing the law, or the dynamic each person faces if they attempt to achieve righteousness by their own human efforts. And I think you can do that as a believer or an unbeliever. In fact, the already not yet concept would go, you as a believer, transformed by the Spirit and renewed and so forth, you can make choices so that you're actually, like a Galatians idea, almost putting yourself back under a wrong thinking or a wrong pattern of thinking until, some of the psychic experience of this is actually going to mirror pre-conversion experience. I mean, if you try to go back and reestablish by your own effort, apart from the Spirit, apart from God's work in your heart, and try to accomplish righteousness, you're basically going to recapitulate more or less what you were experiencing prior. So anyway, I think I've heard other interpreters say it like this. This is anybody who tries to achieve righteousness by the power of their own flesh or apart from the Spirit. And that resonates with me. So that's where I'm going to leave it. I don't have a conclusion either way. I think he is speaking in a paradigmatic framework, and he doesn't really intend to distinguish one way or the other. The last thing I'll toss in there is, remember my comment earlier that, anyway, I try to emphasize several times. The focus of the passage really is not the psychology of Paul, nor who is this individual. The core of the passage is the role of the law. That's really the center of it. So is the law good or is the law bad? And with that as the center of the passage, you can understand then why I think this view maybe solves it a little better, because it keeps the focus on the law instead of bringing the human person into the center. Is he believer or unbeliever? Now, the question is, what's the role of the law? Is the law good? Further resources, if you want to read or get involved in this discussion further, there's a 3 Views book. I have not looked at it at all, but I just pulled these off of the website or the Amazon description, and the 3 views are basically pre-Christian, so unbeliever, Christian, but just hear this language as an accurate representation of what believers go through even after their conversion. I don't find that summary of that doesn't grab me, but anyway, I should check out his argument. And then here, the 3rd view is that Paul is not speaking of his past or his present, more fundamentally and simply about the human being confronted with the law, or the human being confronted with the law. 2 articles. This from the Master's Journal is, I thought, good for summarizing the different views that have gone around, and it's a very simple read. It's a THM article, and so it's not so technical and not so wordy. And if you want to just kind of just get up to speed on the issue, it's a pretty easy read. It's like maybe 30 pages, and it's really easy reading. This is not. This is a dissertation. It's like 400 pages. You can buy it. I kept on seeing this title just in discussions when I was looking for resources as kind of the source to go to, the big granddaddy source that goes in deep. And you can buy it for $30, but if you look around, it's his dissertation, and his dissertation is posted at the school where he wrote it for free. So that link, you can just download it, and it's all legit. I mean, it's completely, it's not evading a copyright or anything. So anyway, that's available, and it's just on their school website. I'll put both of those links in here, and I find them helpful. The second, the dissertation, he has an appendix in the back that I thought was really great, where he gives a history of interpretation, and he just talks you through, from the fathers moving forward, the different views that have been given on this. So anyway, I thought that appendix just that alone was definitely worth it. I would say between the two views, I'm a little more inclined towards the pre-conversion view, but just with the clarification I said earlier that anyone who returns back to the law is going to experience this. I'm looking at chat here to make sure I didn't. Okay. Yeah. So you have that there. And good. On the journal article, here's what I thought about homework for this class. I wanted to give you a little bit of a break because we've had some big articles and some heavy articles. However, I would love, I won't really give it as like an assignment, but I would love, and I think you would benefit from taking, here's my recommendation, just maybe take 30 minutes. Take 30 minutes and kind of just scroll through those two articles, the journal article as easy reading material, and then the dissertation, you might want to look at the appendix or something. And I think you might just benefit from looking at those. So I wouldn't give that I'm not giving that as an assignment, but I would encourage you, and I think you would benefit from it if you do. So, yes, a question?
Yeah, the link for the J Street article is the same one you put for the other one.
Oh, you're right. Sorry. Okay. Well, I can Google for it. I think if you, let's see, we'll just try Googling for J Street Master's Journal, Romans 7. Sorry. Yeah, I was probably moving too fast and copy pasted twice. Here you go. Yep. So I'll just drop this in here, and that's the correct link. Sorry about that. There we go. Okay, systematic theology question. Would you say that believers have two natures? If the flesh is the entirety of our being, is the new nature also the entirety of our being? In what sense are we a new creature if our sin nature is all that we are? Is nature the same as one's entire person? Oh, man. Can I think about it? Yeah, and what I want to do is think about it and look at Bavinck. And then I also just want to try to understand the word nature and the way that Scripture itself is using it. My intuition here is that we're probably using nature in a philosophically or systematic theology defined way, and so then it takes on a life of its own. But I'd like to see how we can link it back to biblical information, and I'd be glad for any thoughts you have, Dr. K, or others on that. So yeah, sometimes this goes into the old man, new man passages that happen in Colossians and Ephesians and actually in Romans. I read those a little differently, but that's another story. But sometimes we'll talk, the old man, the new man, and so you need to put off the old man versus put on the new man. I read the Ephesians passage to say the old man has been put off and you have put on the new man. And that's represented, I think, in Pillar Commentary. Is that O'Brien? So he argues for that. I like that reading of Ephesians 4. So yeah, therefore it's an indicative, not an imperative. And I do think, like the way I was taught in seminary as well, the old man is your past you. So everything prior, like one of my teachers, Dr. Minnick, would always emphasize, like volume 1, volume 2, the old man is your life prior to your salvation. The new man is you post-salvation. So the idea of those things kind of continuing on within us and being at war, more like the black dog, white dog thing, not so much. But I'd like to think about the question you asked is hard. So let me go to Romans 8, and as I said, I have no intention of covering Romans 8, but I'll show you a couple of things here. And then next time, Andrew Minnick will hit more of the details for that. And another question someone asked in there as far as homework, I'm following up. I haven't gotten homework back from him yet, so we'll see. Maybe, anyway, if I can get it, I'll probably give him a call, and we'll see if we can get it up even today. But work with that. Here, structure for Romans 8. I'll just focus on the second part. So verses 1-4, Christ's death has freed us from condemnation. The flesh versus the spirit, relationship with the spirit results in practical, lived out righteousness. Hope in the coming new creation, so it shifts in an eschatological direction. The Spirit's blessing, present blessings in prayer and in providence, and then rejoicing in the confident, unshakable hope. This is that, that concluding section, who shall separate us from the love of Christ. Something that I thought was helpful here is chapters 8, 1-17 link backward to explain chapter 7. So if you, particularly chapter 7, verse 6, you can kind of see where some of this is left open as a question. We are released from the law, having died to that which held us captive, so that we serve in the new way of the Spirit and not the old way of the written code. I've not thought about this until now, so it may not be a good idea, but captive here sounds to me like it's echoing chapter 6. You remember, okay, you can see the green. You go back here, look at all the green, the slaves concept. So is verse 6 echoing chapter 6, bringing in the captive notion, tying it in with the way of the Spirit, contrasting it with the law, and then there is a kind of a triumphal element of it. We are released from the law. That points ahead, I think, to chapter 8 here. There is therefore now no condemnation. For the law of the Spirit of life has set you free. I mean, you see that language? The law of the Spirit of life has set you free sounds like verse 6, now we are released from the law. So it's kind of like he reached this point in the argument, he kind of paused, and he's going to explain the goodness of the law, moving downward through here. But he's pausing here because he's going to pick this up in 8:1 and following, 8:1-17. So the 8:1-17 become an explanation of verse 6. Anyway, I found that helpful, just how the flow of the thought or the flow of the discussion is going. I think I'll just end with this, and because I have 1 minute. The already not yet, let me just put that thought out there by showing you a contrast here in a set of passages. And the set of contrast is to say we are set free from sin, but there's also an imperative in it that's mixed in there together. Let not sin therefore reign in your mortal body to make you obey its passions. Well, I mean, we are already dead with Christ to that sin. So it's that concept that I said earlier, be what you are, or be what you are becoming. We are already enjoying or anticipating the future. If Christ is in you, though the body is dead because of sin, the Spirit is life because of righteousness. If the Spirit of him who raised Jesus from the dead dwells in you, he who raised Christ Jesus from the dead will also give life to your mortal bodies through the Spirit who dwells in you. It's anticipatory. We're already enjoying the future benefits ahead of time. Verse 12, we're debtors not to the flesh to live according to the flesh. Actually, I'm going to skip down to verse 23. Not only the creation, we ourselves who have the first fruits of the Spirit, groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for adoption as sons, the redemption of our bodies. The Spirit and the recreation, the resurrection, that's a future thing. We have the first fruits of that. We wait eagerly for it. We enjoy it early in a way. It's kind of getting started in the process early, even though God has not already brought about the full redemption, the full victory. And you can do this finally in Galatians 5, talking about walking by the Spirit, you will not gratify the desires of the flesh. We're already enjoying ahead of time some of the fruits of that victory. I think that's where Andrew Minnick is going to go. So that's just the concept that I would leave there, and I think he's going to build that concept out. And to encourage us as we go, my takeaway from chapters 7 and 8 were just how extraordinarily complex our salvation is. If I compare it to, I think of like Islam and a framework of salvation where Allah just, by fiat, he just says, okay, you go into paradise. And I compare that with the complexity of the gospel and how involved it is for us to be forgiven. It really takes me and causes me, I mean, it has to make you marvel. the thickness of what God did so that I can be forgiven and accepted in his sight. And we'll get more into that in Romans 8, but his giving the Spirit and his setting us free, the propitiation idea back all the way in chapter 3, just the complexity of what he did, I think gives us a thicker and richer appreciation. It's not just a fiat, okay, I forgive you, you can go to paradise. But it is his provision through Christ making this possible. It's amazing. It's mind-blowing. So I hope that we can leave these chapters exulting and grateful for all of the richness of that. Thank you for your time. And if you have further questions, then of course message, or we can interact further as classes go forward. And then I will plan to take these notes and get them edited up so I can put them on the Google Classroom if you want to take a look there. So, great. Okay, thank you. We'll see you next time. Look forward to continuing on with some of this.